Well, hey everybody, welcome to day 3 of these live video conversations regarding theological development and the First World War. If you've missed the first two, you can find them on the Northside Church of Christ Facebook page, facebook.com/inside.org. Or on my Facebook page, and hopefully in the next few days I'm going to migrate all of these also over to YouTube and kind of stash them on a channel there, so there are some options for you. If you've missed the first two and are just going to hop in today, I'll give you just a quick recap of where we've been so far. All right, let me double check and make sure that the audio is working because, let's just pull that out of there. All right. Just a second, I'm checking Facebook to see how audio is going. Hey, can you hear me now? I see a couple of y'all have commented. Anybody give me some feedback? All right, perfect. Just a second, I'm checking Facebook to see how audio is going. Hey. So you're going to hear my phone here in just a second. All right, so cool. That no reason to explain why it's not working, but I had to switch to a different microphone, so there we go. Just so background information, we're looking at the relationship between war and Christology, how you understand Jesus specifically before and during the First World War. There are a lot of reasons why I'm picking to teach on this, but mostly because I've already written a book about it. My master's thesis I turned into a easily published small little book that you can grab. I'll call it a quick read. It's not terribly dense, just over 100 pages. And like I've committed to already in this video, should you choose to go buy that either in paperback form through Barnes & Noble or through digital copy, which is available on Amazon and on Barnes & Noble through their Nook. All the money made from you snagging those books goes back to our church during the next month or two. So that option is there for you if you want to grab it and read it instead of seeing it in spoken form. There's a lot more information there. I'm not just doing a reading of the thesis, but there we go. So all of that's kind of the background here. World War I serves as an interesting turning point. It's the first time we really see total warfare, where war is felt not just on the battlefield and in the areas nearby, like most war is up until that point, but really involves the whole machinery of a nation. And what I mean by that is, and you see this most in Germany, but it's definitely true in all of the combatant nations. Whether or not you are anywhere near a front, there's a good chance that the only reason you're not, if you're a guy, is if you work in a field that is considered necessary for the war. So if you are in mining or if you are in an agricultural discipline that involves providing food for the military, you got a pass. Otherwise, you were recruited, drafted, forced, however you want to look at that, by many of the nations to go to war. It became a crisis on a grand scale. Anytime you meet a war whose death measures in the millions, you've gotten there. The General Napoleon, about 100 years before this war, once told one of his counterparts on the battlefield, "You can't defeat me. I spend 30,000 lives a month as a matter of cause." This is a war where you will see 30,000 casualties in a day on more than one occasion. So Napoleon's grand brag pales in comparison just 100 years later. death on the battlefield affects everyone, and there are, during the war, neighborhoods, because people will sign up together to be in their same unit with people from their school, their hometown, their neighborhoods. There are neighborhoods that lose massive numbers of people in a day. The suffering doesn't get spread out, it gets very localized. And with all of these things influencing how people think and view the world and react to what's going on, it's only natural that it ends up affecting how they view their faith, how they view Christianity, how they view Christ. So today we are picking up where I told you we would. First day I gave you an introduction. Yesterday I talked about what Christology looked like in Germany before the war. Today I'm talking about what Christology looks like in the United States before the war. It is an interesting field to look at in the United States before the war, with all sorts of voices playing in. But I'll give you a bit of the background first. It really isn't until the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 1800s, that Jesus begins to be a factor in American Christianity. Now, I get that may be the weirdest thing you've ever heard. Christianity and Christ sort of seem like they would go together, but if you look at the writings and sermons of American pastors and preachers and theologians in the first stretch of American history in colonial days and then early Revolution days, Jesus doesn't come up a whole lot. Jonathan Edwards' famous Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon, which is an awesome read, you can track down in a dozen places or more online, says very little about Jesus. And only as the 1700s become the 1800s do people begin noticing again that Jesus is sort of a big part of the biblical story and plays an important role, and start talking about him a little bit more. Again, I understand that that's an odd thing to hear, but it's just kind of the way that it plays out in the process. And by the time you get through the American Civil War, you come out on the other side of it. Of course, you lose a decent, I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 600,000 or 700,000 deaths, not just casualties, deaths of American soldiers in the Civil War. Some civilian deaths with that, though certainly not on the scale you see in total warfare later. And you kind of have your own cultural crisis with the abolition of slavery finally coming about. Should have been a non-issue early on, but that's not where we're headed with this today. Church becomes a place in the middle of the 19th century dominated by women. And I'm trying to remember the statistic. I should have gone back and looked. I'll recommend Stephen Prothero's book, American Jesus, How the Son of God Became a National Icon, as a read for you. But I believe at some point in the mid-19th century, 3 out of every 4 people in a pew on any given Sunday in the United States were women. And men just didn't seem to want much of a place inside the church or inside Christianity. By the time you reach the end of the 1800s and Jesus begins to become part of the conversation again, men who are making their way back to church don't necessarily like the portrayal of Jesus that they find there. They don't like the parts of the biblical story where Jesus is emotionally worn. For instance, the garden. They don't like passages about turning the other cheek. And a number of voices who want to see Christianity rise again in the United States, but understand that men don't like that portrayal of Jesus, begin to focus on less on the theological nature of Jesus. They begin to spend less time talking about how and why Jesus might be important, and more time focusing on, our modern phrase would be a cult of personality, the personality of Jesus. Teddy Roosevelt, probably unsurprisingly, plays a role in this. because men, he sees a problem with the drop of masculinity in America. He celebrates a psychologist who writes a book telling kindergarten teachers that they should let kindergarten boys be the primitive savages that they are, which, man, having recently had a kindergarten boy and seeing another one who's going to be there very soon, that seems like an absolutely terrible idea. But Teddy Roosevelt seemed to think it was a good one. And he's not alone. In a lot of ways, Teddy's campaign for an elevated masculinity in America is what lands him in the White House. And so, like, you see all of this conversation surrounding masculinity at the time rise, and because the nation is concerned about the masculinity of men and the country, then they also become concerned about the masculinity, the manliness of Jesus. And so I want to read just a handful of things that I pulled out worth looking at along the way, because there are a number of books that come out. Here are just some of the titles. A Young Man's Jesus, The Virility of Christ, Jesus the Christ in Light of Psychology. One I've got over my shoulder here, The Manhood of the Master, which ends up being a best-selling devotional guide that is published by Harry Emerson Fosdick in 1913. It is a book that celebrates the manliness of Jesus. It doesn't take a whole lot of time to talk about Jesus' purpose or mission. It just talks about how ruggedly handsome and powerful Jesus was. And if you read through the books that I read off earlier, should you track down, they're all well out of print, I believe, at this point. But should you track one down, what you're going to find is that they're very concerned about portraying Jesus as a rough and tumble scrapper who, gets in the dirt and fights for what's right, flips tables when things are wrong, and they don't have a whole lot to say about, the Sermon on the Mount, turning the other cheek, loving your enemies. Those are not helpful in their conversation, so they just kind of leave them out. Now, I'll pause for a second to say people have been doing that right there for a very long time, not just with Jesus, but with the Bible in general. We take and pick the pieces that we like best. We try to explain away the other stuff, and if we can't explain it away, it's just easier to ignore it entirely until somebody brings it up in conversation, and then you try to work your way around it without having to acknowledge that it matters. And you see a whole lot of that around this same time. Here's let me go back. There we go. Here's one from the book, The Virility of Christ, just a short quote. It was written by R. Warren Conant. Here's what he wrote. The men of a strenuous age demand a strenuous Christ. If they fail to find him, the church is to blame, for Christ himself was strenuous enough to satisfy the most exacting. He was stalwart and fearless, aggressive and progressive, never flinching from a challenge, overwhelming in quickness and sharpness of attack, yet withal wary and wise, never rattled, always holding himself well in hand. One of the people who becomes a well-traveled preacher during this period is a guy named Billy Sunday. And I want to pause for a second to say this. Since we moved to Spokane, Lindsay and I have gotten to know another family here in town. We were over at their house for dinner not that long ago. And in conversation around this topic, because it ended up coming out at dinner that I had written about this, some interesting conversation, the mom in the family produces this next guy's Bible. It turns out they're related. It was this magical moment. I wanted to just hold the Bible and drool over it, which is probably not how you should treat a very old and fairly important text. But there it was. It was such a cool moment for me. This guy's name is Billy Sunday. He had been an outfielder for the Chicago White Sox, becomes a follower of Jesus, and hears these voices challenging the lack of masculinity the church seems to portray in Jesus, and then challenges that portrayal of Jesus, begins to travel and speak. Here's what Stephen Prothero has to say about Billy Sunday. He was the hottest act in the country in the years preceding World War I, in part because he gave a voice to a more virile form of revivalism that proved attractive to both men and women. While other Protestant preachers were displaying their erudition, Sunday displayed his muscles, sliding across the stage as if barreling into home plate. "Lord save us," Sunday prayed, from off-handed, flabby-cheeked, brittle-boned, weak-kneed, thin-skinned, pliable plastic, spineless, effeminate, sissified, 3-carat Christianity. Instead of urging fellow Christians to turn the other cheek, he challenged male listeners to fight the good fight, and his female listeners to embrace macho men, including the manly Redeemer. If you read how he wrote and how he spoke, Billy Sunday's messages are coarse. His goal was to deliver an attractive message to men coming out of the factories and mines. He said something to the effect of, "I don't want them to have to show up to church with a dictionary in hand." And he was successful in the process. And, you know, I think there are bits and pieces of what he has to say that are important to hear. I think you do some damage when you ignore entire portions of Scripture and able to portray what you want people to hear. All of that, for the sake of our conversation right now, is neither here nor there. What I'm trying to get you to hear is that in the lead up to the war, what people are most concerned in the United States, this is not global, this is very much cultural and localized, what they're most concerned about when it comes to Jesus is his masculinity and his manliness. Here's another one from a guy that ends up becoming a fairly important, very important voice in American Christianity during the early and middle part of the 20th century. A guy named Reinhold Niebuhr. Oh, hold on. Did I miss what I was looking for? Y'all are going to have to bear with me just for a moment because I believe I marked the wrong thing. Oh, here we go. All right, so I'm going to read you just a short bit out of his memoir called Leaves from a Notebook that he wrote right after the United States had declared war, maybe right before. I don't have an exact date on it. I just know where it falls year-wise. It's either right before or right after the U.S. has declared war. And he's made a visit to a military training camp. Here's what he writes after his visit. "What I dislike most of the chaplains is that they assume a very officious and also a very masculine attitude. Ministers are not used to authority and revel in it when it's acquired." That's probably true. The rather too obvious masculinity which they try to suggest by word and action is meant to remove any possible taint which their Christian faith might be suspect to have left upon them in the middle of the he-men in the army. My brother is right. He tells me that he wants to go into the army as a private and not as a chaplain. He believes that the war is inevitable, but he is not inclined to reconcile its necessity with the Christian ethic. He will merely forget about this difficulty during the war. That's much more honest than what I'm doing. So you can hear again in Reinhold Niebuhr's words there a recognition that Christianity of the past, and one of the accusations leveled against it during the time of World War I, is that Christians, by way of their portrayal of Jesus, are just too weak and effeminate to really be any use in the army. And so when the chaplains go in, they have to portray themselves as hyper-masculine in order to ward off any accusations that their faith might play down their manliness, their dedication, and devotion. Again, there are all sorts of reasons why that attitude is a hot pile of garbage, but we again see here this extra emphasis on the relationship between manliness, masculinity, and Jesus. So these are all of the conversations that are taking place in American Christianity before the war. I'll take a moment just to talk about the ways in which, hold on, we're being interrupted. Hi, Hadley. Can you wait? What do you want? You want the kinetic sand? You're going to have to wait a few minutes because I can't get up right now and go get it for you. Can you ask Mama?
I don't know where she is.
Well, she'll be out in a minute. She may be downstairs in the basement. Go back to the playroom.
I'm just going out here in your lap.
No, not in my lap. That's going to be too distracting. Say bye.
Bye.
and she's placed herself on the sofa next to us. All right, Hadley, I'm working on something, okay? There you go. You gonna sit right there? All right, cool. So you can see the ways in which that type of conversation might influence young men in the United States as they make their way towards war. That might influence their response. Now, I don't want to be too general here, so I want to make sure that you understand that that is not the only thought in the United States. There are plenty of young men who serve as conscientious objectors. There are plenty of churches that do not encourage the view of Jesus as this hyper-masculine soldier who would pick up arms and go to war with other nations in the process. There are plenty who don't do that. But there's this dominant current that is speaking of Jesus as this hyper-masculine warrior. And if that is what you grow up hearing, then it obviously shapes how you respond whenever a call to arms is presented. Now, the other thing I need to make sure and be clear here is that for the first few years of World War I, the dominant the dominant feeling in the United States is that they would really prefer to stay out of the war. During the presidential campaign, as Woodrow Wilson ran for his second term, the Republican running against him had to ask Teddy Roosevelt to quit campaigning on his behalf. Teddy Roosevelt was so pro-war and was so hard on Wilson for not jumping in at the drop of a hat that he sounded like a warmonger, and the Republican candidate for president that year wasn't any more inclined to go to war than Wilson was. So he had to tell Teddy Roosevelt to shut up and go away because he was causing him problems. And in fact, I think there's a pretty good argument to be made that Roosevelt may have done some damage in that process with the attitude that he brought towards it. He publicly condemned Woodrow Wilson over and over, called him yellow, called him a coward. He felt it was shameful that the United States wasn't in the war. And it really didn't have all that much to do with choosing sides. I'm not sure Roosevelt could have really come up with a good argument over which side they should have gone in on. There were plenty of German Americans and Irish Americans who were not inclined to see the U.S. go into the war against Germany on behalf of the Brits and team up. Woodrow Wilson is always concerned about revolt inside the country should something like that happen. There are thousands of German language newspapers being printed in the country during that time. Huge numbers of German immigrants who still have an affinity for the homeland, even though that they've come across the sea. And you see people who have come to the United States from all of the combatant nations go back home to join in and fight on whatever side they find themselves on, whichever country they were from beforehand. Wilson's got some concerns about civil war erupting inside the United States, whichever side he goes in on. And so all of that's kind of playing out and makes staying out of the war the most attractive option for Wilson and for a lot of other people. The majority of the country was against it. But while they were against getting into that war at the time, they were not against war in general. You see the United States nearly go to war with Mexico twice in the early 1900s. The U.S. Army has just finished chasing Pancho Villa across northern Mexico. They're not against taking up arms. They're very much for it. What has been drilled into them, both inside of Christianity and out, is that what they need in order to do so is right reasons and proper provocation. This comes up in Fosdick's Manhood of the Master. He alludes to this when it comes to war by saying that Jesus does not raise offense when he is personally slighted, which I would challenge. He gets pretty frustrated with the Pharisees based on some of the stuff that they throw his way. But again, neither here nor there. But he says when anybody else is offended, then Jesus he says something to the effect of lashes out. He uses pretty violent language to communicate it. That's a pretty good image of how the majority of the people in the United States felt in the lead up to World War I. If they're looking to Jesus as a model for how they should respond, what they're looking for is a reason. Just give us a reason, give us a provocation, and we'll do it. So, that's good coffee. The first day that we did this series, I asked you a question. For those of you who have seen it already, I asked you to grab a piece of paper and answer 2 questions. The first question was, who is Jesus? And describe who Jesus is to you. And the second question was, how does that influence how you would respond to war? Yesterday I talked about the general feeling of who Jesus was in Germany in the lead up to World War I. How he was a model of personal piety, how he showed what it looked like to live in regard to your neighbor, but how that was designed to fit into a nice little box and not really influence how you respond to anything outside of that. Hold on. Okay, not right now, Hadley. Y'all are about to get to listen to a lovely Hadley fit, I think. You don't really want to throw a fit in front of all these people, do you? We're almost done. Can you please go back up to the playroom while I finish? You're helping me make this a real professional production. Here I am in a t-shirt, barefoot, and shorts, and you screaming on the floor. All right, cool. Now I hope you have a better understanding of why I asked that question. I'm not going to dive into the Christological thought in every country before World War I. I started to go that route on my paper because I had no clue how much information I would have to work with. This isn't a topic that has been taken on directly by really anybody. A few people have talked around it, but not directly to it. I ended up having to narrow it down just to Germany and the United States in the end because it would have been way too much information to go through. But you can see the differences just between those 2 countries. One country where the consensus thought on who Jesus is a model of personal piety, and another country whose consensus thought is that who Jesus is a model of masculinity, and how those 2 ideas affect how people end up responding. All right, I think that serves as a pretty good wrap-up point. We're going to pick up tomorrow with Germany at the beginning of the war. You want to sit with me as I finish up? Can you wave again? We're going to look at sermons and writings that come from Germany's theologians and poets, their professors, several of which will come from J.P. Bang's book, which is a collection of all of those things, but we'll look at some of the other things that come out that are written at the time in the process. All right. Glad you were with us today. I hope you're enjoying this as we talk about the interplay of kind of the crisis that World War I creates and how people move towards it, how their faith influences them, and then the other part that we don't like to talk about is how what they want or need to happen influences what they choose to believe. So we'll get more into that next time. Oh, that's gross. All right. Bye, y'all.